Alexis de Tocqueville begins his philosophy by observing something that most people living inside a system fail to notice: that democracy is not simply a political arrangement or a method of choosing leaders, but a slow and powerful transformation of the human condition itself, a quiet force reshaping how people think, feel, relate to one another, and understand their place in the world. And what makes his thinking so enduring is that he does not approach democracy as a cheerleader or an enemy, but as a careful witness to its hidden consequences, tracing how equality, once introduced into society, does not remain confined to laws or institutions, but seeps into habits, expectations, and even the inner life of individuals, creating a world where the desire to be equal becomes as strong as the desire to be free, and sometimes even stronger, pulling people toward a shared condition that feels comforting but carries subtle risks that are easy to overlook. He sees equality as an irreversible movement, something that cannot simply be undone by policy or resisted by tradition, because it arises from deep historical currents, from the gradual erosion of aristocratic structures that once fixed people into rigid hierarchies, and as those hierarchies dissolve, individuals begin to see themselves as fundamentally similar to one another, no longer bound by inherited ranks, but defined by their own choices and opportunities. And this shift creates a new kind of society where ambition becomes more widespread, where comparison becomes constant, and where people measure themselves not against distant elites, but against their immediate neighbors, creating both motivation and anxiety, a restless energy that drives progress, but also prevents satisfaction from ever fully settling in. Within this democratic condition, he notices a paradox that quietly shapes human behavior, that as people become more equal, they also become more isolated because the old bonds of class, family tradition, and inherited obligation weaken, leaving individuals freer but also more alone. And in this solitude, each person turns inward, focusing on their own interests, their own comfort, their own small circle of life, developing what he calls a form of individualism that is not selfishness in a crude sense, but a calm withdrawal from the larger community, a tendency to believe that one's responsibilities end with one's immediate surroundings. And this withdrawal, though understandable, slowly erodes the shared fabric that allows a society to function as something more than a collection of separate lives. He understands that this individualism creates a quiet vulnerability, because when people disengage from public life, they leave a space that power can easily fill. And here emerges one of his most subtle and unsettling insights, that the greatest danger to democracy is not sudden tyranny imposed from above, but a gentle, almost invisible form of control that grows when citizens, preoccupied with their private concerns, become willing to let a central authority manage the complexities of society for them, trading participation for convenience, responsibility for comfort, and in doing so, they do not feel oppressed but rather protected, guided, and even relieved, unaware that their independence is slowly being softened. This form of power does not resemble the harsh dictatorships of the past, but something far more adaptive, a system that does not break wills but shapes them, that does not silence voices but makes them irrelevant, surrounding individuals with a network of regulations, services, and guidance that reduces the need for personal initiative, until people begin to lose not their rights in a visible way, but their habit of using them. And over time, the very idea of active citizenship fades into something abstract, replaced by a passive expectation that the system will take care of everything, allowing people to focus on their own lives without interference, while the deeper structure of control remains largely unquestioned. At the same time, he recognizes that democracy carries within it a powerful force for intellectual conformity, not imposed by rulers but generated by the majority itself. Because when all individuals are seen as equal, the opinion of the majority gains a kind of moral authority that is difficult to resist, creating a social pressure that discourages deviation, not through punishment, but through isolation. And in this environment, people begin to self-censor, not out of fear of legal consequences, but out of a desire to belong, to avoid standing apart from the collective judgment. And this produces a subtle narrowing of thought, where originality becomes risky and agreement becomes comfortable, shaping a culture that appears free on the surface but is quietly guided by invisible expectations. He is particularly attentive to the way this majority influence affects the mind, noting that in democratic societies, individuals are less likely to rely on tradition or inherited wisdom, but also less likely to develop deeply independent thinking, instead turning to common opinion as a shortcut, trusting what is widely accepted rather than undertaking the difficult work of critical reflection. And this creates a strange balance where people are intellectually independent in principle, but dependent in practice, guided not by authority figures, but by the diffuse weight of collective belief, which can be just as powerful in shaping behavior and limiting perspective. Yet his philosophy is not a rejection of democracy, but a call to understand its tendencies so that they can be balanced. And he sees within democratic societies the potential for a different kind of strength, one that emerges not from hierarchy, but from voluntary association, from the ability of individuals to come together freely to pursue shared goals, creating networks of cooperation that counteract isolation and restore a sense of collective purpose. And he views these associations not as minor details, but as essential structures that sustain freedom, because they keep individuals engaged, active, and connected to something beyond themselves. He places particular importance on local institutions and civic participation, seeing them as schools of freedom where people learn the habits necessary for self-government. Because freedom is not simply a legal condition, but a practice skill, something that must be exercised regularly to remain alive. And without these opportunities for participation, individuals lose the experience of shaping their environment, becoming spectators rather than actors in the life of their society. And once this habit is lost, it becomes difficult to recover, because people grow accustomed to being guided rather than guiding. Religion, in his view, also plays a complex role within democracy, not as a source of political authority, but as a stabilizing force that provides moral boundaries and a sense of meaning that extends beyond material concerns. And in a society where equality encourages people to focus on tangible success and immediate gratification, religion offers a counterbalance, reminding individuals of limits, responsibilities, and a dimension of life that cannot be reduced to comfort or utility. And this helps prevent the drift toward a purely materialistic existence, where the pursuit of well-being becomes the central goal and deeper questions are quietly set aside. He is aware that democratic societies are especially vulnerable to materialism, because when individuals see themselves as equal, they often become preoccupied with improving their conditions, striving for prosperity not only out of necessity, but out of comparison. And this constant pursuit can become consuming, narrowing attention to what can be gained, owned, or enjoyed. And while this drive fuels economic growth and innovation, it also risks creating a culture where meaning is measured in tangible terms, where success is defined by accumulation, and where the inner life becomes secondary to external achievement. In tracing these patterns, he reveals a vision of democracy that is neither idealized nor condemned, but understood as a complex and evolving condition, filled with both promise and danger, where the same forces that empower individuals can also weaken them, where equality can lead to both justice and conformity, where freedom can coexist with subtle forms of dependence. And the outcome is not fixed, but shaped by how people respond to these tendencies, whether they remain passive within them or actively work to balance and counteract them, preserving the deeper spirit of freedom that democracy makes possible. As this democratic condition continues to unfold, he turns his attention more deeply toward the inner transformation of the individual, noticing that equality does not merely alter external relationships, but quietly reshapes the way people think about time, ambition, and even the meaning of their own existence. Because when social distances shrink and inherited positions lose their weight, the future begins to feel open in a way that is both liberating and unsettling, and individuals, no longer anchored by fixed roles, begin to imagine that their lives can be molded entirely by their own efforts, creating a constant orientation toward what comes next, a restless anticipation that drives action but rarely allows for stillness, as if the present moment is always being sacrificed for a future that remains just out of reach. In this atmosphere, he observes a peculiar impatience that takes hold of democratic societies, a tendency to desire rapid results, immediate improvements, and visible progress. Because when everyone believes that advancement is possible, waiting begins to feel like failure, and this impatience extends beyond material goals into thought itself, where ideas are often valued not for their depth or permanence, but for their usefulness and accessibility, leading to a culture that favors clarity over complexity, speed over reflection, and practical outcomes over abstract contemplation. And while this makes knowledge more widely available, it also risks flattening the richness of intellectual life, reducing it to something that can be quickly consumed rather than slowly understood. He notices that this same impatience influences the way people relate to one another, as relationships themselves become more fluid and less bound by obligation, allowing individuals to move freely between connections, but also making those connections more fragile. And in such a world, trust becomes something that must be constantly rebuilt rather than inherited, and community becomes something that must be actively maintained rather than passively received, requiring effort and intention that many, absorbed in their own pursuits, are not always willing to give. And so the social fabric, though wide and inclusive, can feel thin, lacking the density that once came from shared histories and enduring ties. At the level of thought, he becomes increasingly aware of how democratic equality shapes the way individuals seek truth, recognizing that when traditional authorities lose their dominance, people are left to navigate a vast landscape of opinions without clear guidance. And in this openness, they often gravitate toward what is most familiar, most widely accepted, or most easily understood, forming beliefs not through deep examination, but through a kind of collective intuition. And this creates a world where ideas spread quickly but may lack solidity, where certainty is often borrowed from the crowd rather than built from within, and where the effort required for genuine, independent thinking becomes something that fewer people are willing to undertake. This does not mean that individuals lose their capacity for reason, but rather that the conditions of democracy subtly discourage its fullest exercise, because true independence of mind requires time, solitude, and a willingness to stand apart, all of which run against the prevailing currents of a society that values connection, agreement, and constant movement. And so the mind, like the individual, becomes both freer and more constrained, liberated from old authorities, but quietly shaped by new forms of influence that are less visible, but no less powerful. He reflects on how language itself begins to change under these conditions, becoming more simplified and standardized as people seek to communicate across increasingly equal and interconnected social spaces. And while this shared language makes communication more efficient, it can also limit the expression of nuance, narrowing the range of thought that can be easily articulated. And in this way, even the tools of thinking are subtly adjusted to fit the needs of a democratic society, reinforcing its tendencies toward clarity, accessibility, and uniformity. Yet within all of this, he continues to search for the forces that might preserve depth and individuality. And he finds one of them in the deliberate cultivation of intellectual and moral independence, not as a natural outcome of democracy, but as a conscious effort that must be sustained against its pressures, requiring individuals to resist the comfort of conformity and the ease of borrowed opinions, and instead to engage in the slow and often difficult work of forming their own judgments, even when those judgments place them at odds with the majority. Because it is only through this effort that the true potential of freedom can be realized, not as mere equality of condition, but as the ability to think and act with genuine autonomy. He also returns to the idea of association, but now with a deeper understanding of its necessity, seeing it not only as a practical tool for achieving common goals, but as a vital counterweight to the isolating tendencies of individualism. Because when people come together voluntarily, they create spaces where ideas can be exchanged, challenged, and refined, where individuals are reminded of perspectives beyond their own. and where the habit of participation keeps the spirit of public life alive, preventing society from dissolving into a collection of disconnected pursuits. In examining the role of political structures, he becomes aware that the design of institutions alone cannot guarantee freedom, because even the most carefully constructed system depends on the character and habits of the people who inhabit it, and if those people become passive, disengaged, or overly dependent on centralized authority, the institutions themselves will gradually reflect that passivity, shifting from instruments of self-government into mechanisms of administration. In this, transformation can occur so slowly and smoothly that it is barely noticed, as each small step appears reasonable, each extension of control justified by convenience or necessity, until the cumulative effect becomes something far more significant than any single decision. He sees that democratic societies are particularly prone to this gradual centralization, not because they seek domination, but because they seek order and efficiency, and in doing so, they often turn to a central power to coordinate and manage the complexities that arise from equality. And while this centralization can bring stability and coherence, it also concentrates influence in ways that could diminish local initiative and personal responsibility, creating a system where decisions are made at a distance from those they affect, and where individuals, accustomed to being guided, begin to lose the habit of guiding themselves. At the same time, he recognizes that this tendency is not inevitable, that it can be balanced by a strong culture of local engagement and decentralized participation, where individuals remain actively involved in shaping their immediate environments, preserving a sense of agency that resists the pull toward passive dependence. And in this balance, he sees the possibility of a democracy that maintains both equality and freedom, not as static conditions, but as dynamic forces that must be continually adjusted and sustained. He is careful to show that the health of such a society depends not only on laws or institutions, but on something more subtle and enduring, the everyday habits of thought and action that shape how individuals relate to one another and to the larger whole. And these habits, once formed, become self-reinforcing, either strengthening the foundations of freedom or quietly eroding them, depending on whether they encourage engagement or withdrawal, independence or conformity, responsibility or reliance. And so his philosophy deepens into a meditation on vigilance, not in the sense of constant alarm, but in the quiet awareness that the most significant changes in a democratic society often occur gradually, through small shifts in behavior, expectation, and belief, and that preserving freedom requires attention not only to dramatic events, but to these subtle transformations. Recognizing that the direction of society is shaped as much by everyday choices as by grand decisions, and that within the ordinary patterns of life, the future of democracy is continuously being formed. As these patterns settle more deeply into the structure of democratic life, his attention moves toward a quieter and more intimate dimension, where the relationship between freedom and dependence becomes less visible yet more decisive. Because what begins as a social tendency gradually becomes a psychological habit, shaping not only how people act, but how they perceive their own capabilities. And in this subtle shift, individuals who are formally free may begin to feel increasingly uncertain about their ability to navigate the world without guidance, not because they lack intelligence or potential, but because they have grown accustomed to systems that anticipate their needs, organize their choices, and reduce the complexity of decision-making into manageable paths. And over time, this quiet assistance, though often beneficial in appearance, can diminish the inner confidence required for true independence. He recognizes that this transformation does not occur through force or coercion, but through a kind of gradual adaptation, where each convenience accepted, each responsibility delegated, each decision simplified, seems reasonable in isolation. Yet together, they create a condition in which individuals begin to prefer ease over effort, clarity over uncertainty, and security over risk. And this preference, once established, reshapes the expectations people have of society itself, leading them to value systems that protect and provide rather than those that challenge and demand participation. And in this environment, the meaning of freedom slowly shifts from active self-direction to comfortable stability, where the absence of difficulty is mistaken for the presence of liberty. Within this evolving mindset, he detects a growing tension between equality and excellence, because when all individuals are placed on the same level, the recognition of distinction becomes more complicated, not formally restricted, but socially muted, as the desire to avoid hierarchy leads to a reluctance to elevate certain ideas, achievements, or individuals above others. And while this preserves a sense of fairness, it can also discourage the pursuit of greatness, replacing admiration with cautious acknowledgement, and creating a culture where standing out feels less like an aspiration and more like a risk of separation, subtly encouraging people to remain within the bounds of what is commonly accepted. This influence extends into education and intellectual life, where the goal increasingly shifts toward accessibility and general competence rather than depth and mastery, as systems are designed to serve the many rather than cultivate the few. And while this broadens opportunity, it also alters the character of knowledge itself, favoring what can be widely distributed over what requires prolonged dedication. And in this way, the pursuit of understanding becomes more uniform, less driven by intense curiosity or rigorous inquiry, and more shaped by shared standards that prioritize usefulness and clarity over complexity and originality. He continues to explore how these tendencies affect public discourse, noticing that as individuals become more alike in condition, their conversations also begin to reflect a narrowing range of perspectives, not because disagreement disappears, but because the framework within which disagreement occurs becomes more limited, shaped by common assumptions that are rarely questioned. And this creates a form of intellectual rhythm where ideas circulate within a defined space, rarely breaking beyond it. And those who attempt to introduce radically different viewpoints often find themselves not openly opposed, but quietly disregarded, their voices fading into the background of a conversation that moves forward without them. At the same time, he observes that democratic societies possess a remarkable resilience, a capacity to correct themselves through gradual adjustment rather than abrupt transformation, because the same equality that produces conformity also allows for widespread participation, and within this participation lies the potential for renewal, as individuals and groups, when sufficiently motivated, can re-engage with public life, challenge prevailing assumptions, and reshape the direction of society. And this possibility, though not always realized, remains an essential feature of democracy, preventing it from becoming entirely static or closed. He reflects on the role of ambition within this context, recognizing that while equality opens opportunities, it also intensifies competition, as individuals strive to distinguish themselves within a field where everyone is theoretically capable of advancement. And this competition, though often productive, can also become exhausting, creating a constant pressure to achieve, to improve, to move forward. And in this relentless movement, people may lose sight of deeper forms of fulfillment, measuring their lives by progress rather than meaning, and finding themselves perpetually engaged yet rarely at rest. This restless energy feeds into the broader rhythm of democratic life, where change becomes the norm and stability feels temporary. And in such a world, traditions lose their authority not through deliberate rejection, but through gradual neglect, as each generation, focused on its own possibilities, becomes less connected to what came before. And while this allows for innovation and adaptation, it also creates a sense of discontinuity, where the past no longer provides a stable foundation, and the future remains uncertain, leaving individuals suspended in a present that is constantly shifting beneath them. He becomes increasingly aware that the preservation of depth in such a society requires intentional effort, not only from institutions, but from individuals themselves, who must choose to cultivate habits that resist the prevailing tendencies towards superficiality and distraction, engaging with ideas that demand patience, forming connections that require commitment, and participating in public life with a sense of responsibility that extends beyond immediate self-interest. And without this, effort, the natural drift of democracy leads toward a flattening of experience, where everything becomes accessible but little feels profound. In considering the emotional landscape of democratic societies, he notes a subtle form of unease that can emerge beneath the surface of apparent comfort, a feeling not of oppression, but of incompleteness, as individuals, surrounded by opportunities and conveniences, still sense that something essential is missing, something that cannot be provided by material well-being or social equality alone. And this unease, though often unarticulated, reflects the deeper human need for meaning, for connection, for a sense of belonging to something larger than oneself. And when these needs are not fully met, they can manifest as restlessness, dissatisfaction, or a quiet search for purpose that remains unresolved. Yet he does not view this condition as hopeless, but as a challenge that reveals the true stakes of democratic life, because the very forces that create these tensions also create the possibility of addressing them. If individuals become aware of the patterns shaping their existence and choose to respond with intention rather than passivity, and in this awareness lies the potential for a more balanced form of democracy, one that preserves equality without sacrificing depth, freedom without dissolving into dependence, and individuality without descending into isolation. And so his thought continues to move, not toward a fixed conclusion, but toward a deeper understanding of the delicate balance that defines democratic existence, where every gain carries a hidden cost, every freedom introduces a new responsibility, and the direction of society depends not on any single force, but on the continuous interplay between them, unfolding quietly through the choices, habits, and awareness of those who live within it. As this movement reaches its fullest expression, his thought settles into a quiet but unmistakable clarity, where the question is no longer what democracy does to society, but what individuals within it choose to become, because all the forces he has traced, equality, individualism, centralization, conformity, material desire, do not operate as fixed outcomes, but as pressures, tendencies that shape the environment without fully determining the result. And within that environment, the final direction depends on whether people remain passive within these currents or develop the awareness and discipline required to move against them when necessary, preserving something deeper than comfort, something that cannot be provided by systems alone. He sees that the greatest risk is not the loss of freedom in any dramatic or visible sense, but the slow redefinition of freedom into something smaller, something quieter, until it no longer demands effort or engagement. And when this happens, individuals may continue to believe they are free while rarely exercising the very capacities that make freedom meaningful, allowing decisions to be made elsewhere, accepting guidance without reflection, and gradually losing the sense that they are participants in shaping their own world. And this loss does not feel like oppression. It feels like ease, like order, like life proceeding without friction, which is precisely why it can advance so far without resistance. Against this, he places not a single solution, but a way of living that must be continuously renewed, grounded in the deliberate practice of independence, where individuals choose to think beyond what is immediately given, to question what is widely accepted, and to take responsibility for their role within the larger whole. Not because they are forced to, but because they understand that without this effort, the structures around them will quietly absorb that responsibility, leaving them with less influence over time, even as their formal rights remain intact. He returns again to the importance of association, now seen not only as a social tool, but as a form of resistance against isolation and passivity. Because when individuals come together freely, they create spaces where dependence on centralized authority is reduced, where shared problems are addressed through collective effort rather than distant management, and where the habit of participation becomes a natural part of life, reinforcing the idea that society is not something external to be relied upon, but something internal to be shaped and sustained through ongoing involvement. In this vision, local engagement takes on a deeper significance, not simply as a practical necessity, but as a foundation for preserving the experience of agency, because it is within smaller, immediate context that individuals most clearly see the connection between their actions and their outcomes, and this clarity strengthens the confidence required for self-government, preventing the drift toward a condition where decisions feel too large, too complex, or too distant to influence. A condition that naturally leads to withdrawal and dependence. He also recognizes that the preservation of intellectual independence requires a kind of quiet courage, the willingness to remain thoughtful in a world that rewards speed, to remain distinct in a culture that leans toward uniformity, and to pursue depth in an environment that often favors surface understanding. And this courage is not dramatic or visible. It does not announce itself, but it shapes the quality of thought that underlies all other aspects of life, determining whether individuals merely absorb the patterns around them or actively interpret and reshape them. Religion, or more broadly a sense of moral orientation beyond immediate self-interest, continues to play a role in this balance, not as a constraint on freedom, but as a guide that prevents it from dissolving into aimlessness, offering a framework within which choices gain meaning and limits are understood not as restrictions, but as necessary boundaries that make coherent action possible. And without some form of this orientation, the pursuit of well-being can expand endlessly without direction, leaving individuals surrounded by options but uncertain of purpose. He understands that material prosperity, though valuable, cannot by itself sustain a fulfilling society, because when the pursuit of comfort becomes the central aim, it gradually overshadows other dimensions of life, reducing ambition to acquisition and success to accumulation. And while this may create a stable and orderly environment, it risks becoming inward-looking, focused on maintenance rather than growth, on preservation rather than exploration. And in such a state, the deeper capacities of human life, creativity, reflection, connection, begin to fade into the background. Yet even here, he does not see inevitability, but possibility, because the same equality that encourages material focus also creates the conditions for shared understanding, for empathy across differences, and for the recognition that each individual, though similar in condition, carries a unique perspective that can contribute to the whole. And when this recognition is cultivated, it can counterbalance the tendency toward uniformity, allowing diversity of thought and experience to enrich, rather than divide, strengthening the fabric of society rather than fragmenting it. In the end, his philosophy does not offer a fixed model to be applied, but a lens through which to see the ongoing movement of democratic life, revealing that its greatest strengths and its deepest vulnerabilities arise from the same sources, and that the outcome depends not on eliminating these forces, which cannot be done, but on understanding them well enough to live with them consciously, to encourage what strengthens freedom and to resist what quietly undermines it. And so what remains is a kind of quiet responsibility, not imposed from above, but emerging from within the condition itself, a recognition that equality, once established, does not guarantee the preservation of freedom, but only makes it possible. And that possibility must be realized again and again through the habits, choices, and awareness of individuals who refuse to let ease replace engagement, who choose participation over passivity, depth over simplicity, and meaning over mere comfort. And in this ongoing effort, the true form of democracy is not something that is given once and for all, but something that is continuously created, sustained. Alexis de Tocqueville was born in 1805 in France, into a country still haunted by the aftershocks of revolution. The old monarchy had fallen, been replaced, and fallen again. Power had shifted violently, unpredictably, and often brutally. His own family had lived through this instability directly, with members imprisoned during the Reign of Terror. From the beginning, he grew up with a clear understanding that political systems are not abstract ideas. They shape lives, and when they collapse, they do not do so gently. This early exposure to instability shaped the direction of his thinking. He was not interested in ideal political theories detached from reality. He wanted to understand what makes societies stable, what makes them collapse, and more importantly, what happens to freedom when equality begins to rise. At the time he came of age, something new was happening across the Western world. The old rigid hierarchies of aristocracy were slowly weakening. Equality, at least in a social and political sense, was becoming more visible. People were beginning to move, to vote, to participate in ways that had previously been restricted. Many saw this as progress. Tocqueville agreed, but he also saw something others missed. Equality changes more than laws. It changes the way people think. In 1831, he traveled to the United States, officially to study the prison system. But the journey quickly became something much larger. America presented something rare at the time, a society attempting to build itself around democratic principles rather than inherited hierarchy. What he observed there would define his most famous work, Democracy in America. But he did not simply praise what he saw. He analyzed it carefully, looking for both its strengths and its hidden dangers. At first, what stood out to him was energy. American society was active, decentralized, and full of participation. Local communities governed themselves. Citizens were involved in decision-making. There was a sense that power did not belong entirely to distant authorities. This local structure mattered deeply. He believed that freedom survives more easily when power is distributed across many small institutions rather than concentrated at the top. When people govern locally, they remain engaged. They understand the system because they are part of it. But beneath this energy, he noticed something more subtle. Equality creates independence, but also creates isolation. In aristocratic societies, people are tied together through hierarchy. Their roles are fixed, but they are connected. In democratic societies, those fixed roles begin to dissolve. People become more equal, but also more separate. Each individual begins to focus more on personal life, personal success, and private concerns. This creates a new kind of risk. When individuals become too focused on themselves, they withdraw from public life. They stop participating, stop questioning, and stop paying attention to how power is being used. And when that happens, something dangerous becomes possible. Not violent tyranny, but something quieter, a soft form of control. Tocqueville described a future where people are not oppressed through fear, but guided, managed, and slowly shaped by a central authority that takes responsibility for everything. This authority does not crush people. It comforts them. It provides stability, security, and order, while gradually reducing their independence. Citizens no longer act as active participants. They become passive, allowing decisions to be made for them. He saw this as one of the greatest threats to democratic societies. Not the return of kings, but the rise of a system where people willingly give up responsibility in exchange for convenience. At the same time, he observed the role of associations in American life. People form groups, clubs, and organizations for almost everything. These associations created a network of cooperation that balanced individualism. This was crucial. Where individuals act alone, they are weak. Where they organize, they create a counterbalance to central power. He believed that these associations were one of the strongest protections against the slow growth of centralized authority. He also paid close attention to religion. Unlike many European thinkers, he did not see religion as an obstacle to freedom. In America, he observed that religion often operated separately from political power, providing moral structure without dominating government. This separation created stability. It allowed individuals to pursue freedom while still maintaining a shared sense of limits and responsibility. By the time his observations took full shape, Tocqueville had identified a paradox at the heart of democracy. Equality can strengthen freedom, but can also weaken it. It empowers individuals, but can also isolate them. It removes old hierarchies, but it can create new forms of dependence. And most importantly, it can lead people to value comfort over responsibility. This tension would define everything that followed in his philosophy. Because for Tocqueville, the future of democratic societies did not depend only on laws or institutions. It depended on whether people remained active, engaged, and willing to carry the burden of freedom, or whether they would slowly step back, allowing power to gather quietly in fewer hands, not through force, but through habit, convenience, and a gradual surrender of responsibility. As his analysis deepened, Tocqueville became increasingly focused on a subtle but powerful shift that democracy creates within the human mind. It was not only institutions that changed under equality, but the way individuals understood themselves and their place in society. In aristocratic systems, identity is largely inherited. People are born into roles tied to families, traditions, and long-standing hierarchies. These connections limit freedom, but they also provide structure. A person knows where they belong, even if that place is restrictive. Democracy dissolves this structure. Individuals are no longer fixed in place. They become free to move, to choose, to define themselves. But this freedom comes with an unintended consequence. Without strong, inherited ties, people begin to rely more on themselves alone. This produces what Tocqueville described as individualism. Not simply selfishness, but a quiet withdrawal into private life. People begin to focus on family, career, and personal well-being, while gradually stepping away from broader civic responsibility. Public life becomes distant, something managed by others. At first, this seems harmless, but over time, it changes the balance of power. When citizens withdraw, power does not disappear. It concentrates. This is where Tocqueville introduces one of his most important insights. Democratic societies are vulnerable not only to external control, but to internal disengagement. Tyranny does not always need to force obedience. It can grow in the space left behind when people stop participating. At the same time, he observed that equality changes how people think about authority. In aristocratic systems, authority is accepted as part of the natural order. In democracies, people are less willing to accept superiority in individuals, but more willing to accept the authority of the majority. This creates a new form of pressure. Instead of being dominated by a ruler, individuals can become dominated by public opinion. The majority begins to shape what is acceptable to think, to say, and even to question. Tocqueville saw this as a different kind of danger. Not physical oppression, but intellectual conformity. When people fear isolation or social rejection, they begin to silence themselves. They avoid ideas that challenge the majority, even if those ideas are true. Over time, this reduces the space for independent thought. Freedom of expression may exist in law, but not in practice. This is what he called the tyranny of the majority. It is not enforced by force, but by pressure. And because it feels like collective agreement, it can be more difficult to resist. At the same time, he noticed that democratic societies often prefer equality over liberty without realizing it. Equality provides a sense of fairness and stability. It removes visible privilege and creates a feeling of shared condition. But liberty requires effort. It demands responsibility, participation, and the willingness to tolerate difference and conflict. When given a choice, many people will choose equality, especially if it promises comfort and predictability. This creates a tension at the center of democracy. The very force that makes it possible, equality, can also weaken it. If people begin to value sameness and security more than independence, they may support systems that limit freedom in subtle ways. He also became more aware of the role of centralization. Democratic governments often begin by distributing power, but over time, there is a tendency for authority to gather at the center. This happens gradually, often justified by efficiency, coordination, or the need to solve complex problems. Each step seems reasonable. A central authority can manage resources better. It can provide services more efficiently. It can reduce conflict between regions. But each step also reduces local independence. And because the process is gradual, it rarely feels like a loss of freedom. This is how the soft form of control he feared begins to develop. People do not feel oppressed. They feel managed. They are guided through systems that make decisions easier, reduce uncertainty, and provide stability. But in doing so, they lose the habit of making decisions themselves. Over time, this creates a population that is less capable of self-government. At the same time, He continued to emphasize the importance of local institutions and civic associations as a counterbalance to this trend. When people gather, organize, and participate at smaller levels, they maintain a connection to public life. They practice freedom. Without this practice, freedom becomes abstract. It exists in theory, but not in experience. He believed that the strength of democracy depended not only on its laws, but on its daily habits. Voting alone was not enough. Participation had to be continuous, embedded in everyday life. By this stage, his philosophy reveals something deeper than a simple analysis of political systems. It becomes a study of how freedom can slowly fade without being openly attacked, not through violence, but through comfort, not through fear, but through habit. And beneath all of this lies a quiet but unsettling realization that democratic societies do not lose freedom because they're forced to give it up. They lose it because they stop using it. As his thought continued to deepen, Tocqueville became more focused on something even more subtle than institutions or laws. He began to study how everyday habits, small choices, and ordinary behavior slowly shape the future of a democratic society. He realized that the survival of freedom does not depend only on major political events. It depends on what people do when nothing dramatic is happening. Do they participate, or do they withdraw? Do they question, or do they accept? Do they organize together, or do they remain isolated? These small patterns, repeated over time, determine whether democracy remains active or becomes hollow. This is where his idea of civic life becomes central. In the United States, he observed that people were constantly forming associations. They gathered to solve problems, to build, to debate, to cooperate. These were not always political groups. Many were simple, local, practical, but together they created something powerful. They trained people to act collectively. They gave individuals experience in self-government, not just at the level of the state, but in everyday life. People learned how to disagree, how to organize, how to take responsibility. This practice mattered more than abstract belief. Freedom, in his view, is not just a principle. It is a skill. And like any skill, it weakens when it is not used. At the same time, he became increasingly concerned about what happens when this habit disappears. When people stop organizing, stop participating, and begin to rely entirely on centralized systems, they lose not only influence, but capability. They become dependent. This dependency is not forced. It grows slowly, often welcomed because it simplifies life. Decisions are made elsewhere. Problems are handled by distant authorities. The individual is relieved of effort, but something is lost in that process: the ability to act. Over time, citizens begin to feel smaller in relation to the system that governs them. Not oppressed, but diminished. They no longer see themselves as active participants, but as individuals moving within a structure they do not control. This is where his warning about soft despotism becomes even clearer. It is not a system that terrifies people. It is a system that manages them. It reduces the need for personal responsibility while quietly expanding its reach. It provides order, but at the cost of initiative. It offers stability, but weakens independence. And because it feels comfortable, it is rarely resisted. At the same time, Tocqueville continued to explore the role of equality in shaping these outcomes. Equality makes people more similar, but it also makes them more sensitive to comparison. Individuals begin to measure themselves against others, seeking not just success, but relative success. This creates restlessness. Even in a free society, people may feel dissatisfied, constantly comparing, constantly striving. This restlessness can distract from public life, pulling attention inward toward personal advancement. The more energy is spent on private competition, the less remains for collective responsibility. This is another quiet shift. Freedom is not taken away. It is neglected. He also reflected on how democratic societies approach truth. When authority is no longer based on hierarchy, people turn to the majority for validation. What most people believe begins to carry weight, not because it is proven, but because it is widely accepted. This creates a different relationship with knowledge. Instead of being guided by tradition or elite authority, thought becomes shaped by consensus. This can be positive, allowing ideas to circulate more freely. But it also creates pressure to conform. When a majority becomes the reference point, disagreement becomes more difficult. Over time, this can limit intellectual independence. People may still think, but within boundaries they do not always recognize. This is not enforced by law. It is enforced by expectation. At the same time, he remained aware that democracy carries real strengths. It creates energy, mobility, and opportunity. It allows societies to adapt and change in ways rigid systems cannot. His concern was never to reject democracy, but to understand its weaknesses clearly enough to protect it. This balance defines his philosophy. He does not romanticize the past, nor does he blindly celebrate the future. He stands in between, observing, analyzing, and warning. By this stage, his thought becomes less about describing a specific system and more about identifying a pattern. That freedom can decline not through dramatic collapse, but through gradual transformation. Not through force, but through comfort. Not through oppression, but through quiet dependence. And within that pattern lies his most important insight, that the greatest threat to democracy is not always an external enemy. It is the slow change in how people live, think, and act. Because once individuals lose the habit of participation, once they begin to accept guidance instead of responsibility, the structure of democracy may remain in place, but its spirit begins to disappear. As his life moved toward its final years, Tocqueville's reflections became more focused, not on whether democracy would spread, but on what it would become once it did. He had already seen enough to understand that equality was not a temporary phase. It was a direction history was moving in steadily and almost irreversibly. The deeper question was no longer whether democratic societies would exist, but whether they would remain truly free as they matured. What concerned him most was not sudden collapse, but slow transformation. Democracy, in its early stages, is often energetic. People are engaged, institutions are forming, and participation feels necessary. But over time, as systems stabilize and life becomes more predictable, a subtle shift can occur. The urgency fades. Public involvement begins to feel less essential. People return to private concerns, trusting that the structure will continue functioning on its own. This is where the risk begins. Freedom, he realized, is strongest when it is still being built. It becomes more fragile when it is taken for granted. When citizens assume that liberty is secure, they begin to invest less effort in maintaining it. They participate less, question less, and gradually accept a more passive role in public life. The system does not immediately break. It continues, but with less resistance, less scrutiny, and fewer active participants. At the same time, governments respond to this shift. As individuals withdraw, the demand for coordination and management increases. People still expect stability, solutions, and order, but they are less willing to provide the effort required to sustain them collectively. This creates space for central authority to expand. Not aggressively, but gradually. Responsibilities move upward. Decisions become more centralized. Systems grow more complex, but also more distant from the individuals they affect. Each step appears practical. Each expansion of authority seems justified. And because there is no clear moment of rupture, it does not feel like a loss. This is how the soft despotism he described reaches its most complete form. A system that does not dominate through fear, but through quiet control. It does not demand obedience through force, but encourages dependence through convenience. It reduces the burden of decision-making while also reducing the capacity for independent action. Citizens remain free in appearance, but less engaged in reality. They vote, they speak, they live their lives, but the deeper structure of power operates beyond their active involvement. The relationship between individual and state shifts from participation to reliance. This is not imposed suddenly. It is accepted gradually. At the same time, Tocqueville became increasingly aware that this outcome was not inevitable, but it was always possible. The difference between a free democracy and a managed one does not lie only in laws or institutions, but in habits. Do people continue to act together? Do they continue to question authority? Do they maintain local engagement and responsibility? Or do they slowly retreat into private life, allowing public life to be handled by distant systems? He believed that the future of democracy would be decided in these quiet choices, not only in moments of crisis, but in everyday behavior. He also understood that equality itself would continue to shape this process. As people become more equal, they also become more alike in their expectations. This can create stability, but it can also create uniformity. When everyone begins to think similarly, to value the same things, to avoid conflict in the same ways, society becomes easier to manage. But it also becomes less dynamic, less resistant, less capable of challenging authority. This is where the tension reaches its deepest point. Democracy depends on equality, but equality can lead to conformity. It empowers individuals, but can also make them more willing to follow the majority. And when combined with the desire for comfort and security, it creates the conditions for a system that feels free, but no longer functions as one in its full sense. By the time of his death in 1859, Tocqueville had left behind more than a description of America or a theory of democracy. He had mapped out a long-term pattern, one that extends far beyond his own time. A pattern where freedom is not usually destroyed by force, but reshaped slowly through habits, expectations, and the quiet expansion of centralized power. What makes his work endure is not prediction, but clarity. He does not claim that democracy will fail. He shows how it can change. And in doing so, he leaves behind a responsibility rather than a conclusion. To recognize that freedom is not secured once and for all. It is maintained through use, through participation, resistance, and a willingness to remain engaged even when life feels stable. Because the greatest danger to a democratic society is not always visible. It is the moment when people begin to believe that the system will take care of itself. And once that belief settles in, the balance begins to shift, quietly, gradually, until one day, what remains still looks like democracy from the outside, but no longer carries the same spirit within. That was his final warning. Not that democracy would disappear, but that it could continue to exist in form while losing its substance.